The letter had arrived in October, and Stephen Mercer had not slept a single peaceful night since. He stood at the frost-crusted window of his farmhouse on the outskirts of Calla Creek, Kansas, watching the November wind bend the tall, dead grass flat against the frozen earth, and he thought about her. He did not know her face. He did not know the sound of her voice, or whether she laughed easily or kept herself guarded like some women did when they had seen too much of the world. All he knew was her name, Evelyn Underwood, written in careful, steady letters on the page that now lived folded inside his breast pocket, carried everywhere he went like a second heartbeat. The arrangement had been made through a reputable agency out of Cincinnati, one of the honest operations, not the kind that preyed on desperate women. His sister, Margaret, had pushed him toward it after 2 years of watching him rattle around the 4-room farmhouse alone, eating cold biscuits over the kitchen sink, and talking to his horse more than to any living person. Margaret had filled out the initial inquiry herself, sitting at his table with a determined expression and a pen, and Stephen had sat across from her feeling both mortified and secretly relieved that someone was doing what he could not bring himself to do on his own. The agency had corresponded with him through autumn. He had answered their questions: his age, 31, his occupation, cattle farmer and part-time blacksmith, his land holdings, his church attendance, his temperament, which he described honestly as quiet and steady, and occasionally too stubborn for his own good. They had matched him with Miss Evelyn Underwood of Rochester, New York, age 26, a schoolteacher who had taught primary grades for 4 years and who, according to the agency's careful notes, was practical, well-read, unafraid of hard work, and had her own reasons for seeking a new beginning far from the East. The agency had been clear. She would travel west in the spring. March at the earliest, April most likely, once the mountain passes cleared and the rail lines into Kansas were running reliably again after winter repairs. He had written her a first letter and she had written back, and that exchange had begun a correspondence that was, by December, the most honest conversation he had ever had with another human being. Her letters arrived every 2 weeks, carried by the post rider who came through Calla Creek on Tuesdays. Stephen would stand in the cold outside the post office and read them right there on the street, not willing to wait the 10 minutes it would have taken to ride home. She wrote about Rochester with an affection that was also tinged with something like exhaustion, the way a person talks about a place they have loved but outgrown. She wrote about her students, a boy named Thomas who had memorized every president's name by November, and a girl named Clara who cried every morning when her mother left, but was always the last one still reading when school let out. She wrote about her landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Pratt who made excellent apple cake and had opinions about everything from the proper hemming of skirts to the moral failings of the current administration in Washington. Stephen wrote back in his careful, unpracticed hand, telling her about Calla Creek, about the way the prairie looked in autumn when the light went golden and the sky turned the precise color of a blue jay feather. He told her about his horse, a gray quarter horse named Briar who was 15 years old and still acted like a colt when the weather turned. He told her about his neighbor, old Walt Greer, who had lived on the adjacent property for 40 years and who came over every Sunday for dinner and always fell asleep in the good chair by the fire before the meal was even cleared. He told her about his work, the cattle and the smithing, the rhythm of the days, the particular quiet of winter on the plains that was not lonely so much as vast, the kind of quiet that pressed in from all directions and made a man aware of how much empty space existed in the world. He had not told her, in any letter, how much he thought about her. That felt too large a thing to put in writing when they had not yet met. But he thought about her constantly, in the way a man thinks about something he cannot quite reach, with a steady low ache, a persistent wondering. December deepened. The snow came in earnest, covering the land in a gray-white blanket that muffled sound and turned the world strange and still. Stephen kept himself busy the way he always did in winter, repairing fences, tending the cattle, working the smithy on the days when the cold was not so severe that the iron wouldn't cooperate. He ate supper at Walt's twice a week and let the old man talk about the years before the war, before Kansas had been a state, when the land had been something else entirely, something wilder and more dangerous and in some ways more honest. Walt had been out here since 1857, had watched the border wars between the pro-slavery settlers and the Free Staters tear apart everything that had been built, had buried his wife on this land and raised 3 children and sent them all east for education, and watched them not come back. Walt understood loneliness in a way that did not require explanation. "You are going to wear a hole in that pocket," Walt said one December evening, watching Stephen unconsciously press his hand against his breast pocket while staring into the fire. Stephen looked up. "What? That letter. You have touched it 14 times since you sat down." Stephen let his hand fall to his knee. "I am not counting." "I am," Walt said, and smiled his slow, crinkled smile. Stephen leaned back in his chair and looked at the fire. "She writes well," he said, which was both true and entirely inadequate. "She sounds like a woman worth waiting for," Walt said. "Spring will come." "March," Stephen said. "April at the latest." "That is not so long." But it was long. It was 4 months, possibly 5, and every week that passed felt like a small test of endurance. He wrote her letters and she wrote back, and the correspondence grew more personal with each exchange, more honest, less careful. In January, she told him about her mother, who had died 3 years before, and how that loss had altered the shape of her life in ways she was still trying to understand. She told him she had been engaged once, briefly, to a man in Rochester named Gerald, who had seemed steady and kind, until his family's money disappeared in a bank failure, and he had revealed himself to be neither steady nor particularly kind without financial security behind him. She told him this without self-pity, in a matter-of-fact way that made Stephen respect her more than any other piece of information he had received. He told her, in return, about Clara. His own loss, the woman he had almost married 6 years ago, a girl from Wichita named Clara Brent, who had come out to visit a cousin in Cala Creek, and had stayed for a summer and let him believe they were building toward something real. She had gone back to Wichita in September without a full explanation, and 2 months later, he had learned through the grapevine of small-town correspondence that she had married a merchant who owned 4 shops and a house with a proper parlor. He had not told anyone about Clara, not Margaret, not Walt, not any of the men he worked with. He told Evelyn, in a letter he almost didn't send, because she had been honest about Gerald and it felt dishonest not to be equally open. She wrote back, "It seems we have both been left standing somewhere we expected to be standing with another person. I find that makes me trust you more rather than less. A man who has been disappointed by love and remained decent is a man worth knowing." He read that sentence 7 times standing in the cold outside the post office on a gray Tuesday in January. He thought, "I am already in terrible trouble." February arrived with a blizzard that shut down the roads for 11 days. During those 11 days, no mail moved. No riders came through. The world contracted to the farmhouse, the barn, the paths between them that he shoveled clear twice daily to keep from losing them entirely under the drifting snow. He was cut off from everything, including the twice-weekly letters, and the absence of them was sharper than he expected, a real and physical discomfort, like going without water. On the 8th day of the blizzard, he sat down and wrote a letter he could not send yet, just to have something to do with the feeling. He told her about the snow, the way it came at the windows sideways, the way Briar pressed his big warm nose against Stephen's shoulder in the barn like the horse too was seeking comfort in the storm. He told her about the fire he kept burning and the books he read, and the way the silence during a blizzard was entirely different from the ordinary winter silence, heavier, more complete, like the world had pressed a hand over its own mouth. And then, because the snow was still coming and the night was long and no one would read this letter for days. He wrote, "I find myself looking forward to spring in a way I have not looked forward to anything in a very long time. I find myself hoping, which is something I had gotten somewhat out of the habit of doing. I think you may be responsible for that, Miss Underwood, though we have not yet met. I am uncertain whether to thank you for it or apologize, since hope is a somewhat uncomfortable condition." He sealed the letter. He set it on the table to be sent when the roads opened. He went to bed and lay awake for an hour listening to the wind and thinking about what he had written, feeling both exposed and strangely lighter than he had in months. The roads opened on the 9th day. The snow stopped, the temperature rose fractionally, and Calla Creek shook itself back to life the way a dog shakes off water, vigorously and all at once. By the following Tuesday, the post rider was back, and Stephen stood outside the post office and received 2 letters from Evelyn at once, written on the days when she had expected her own reply from him, and received nothing due to the closed roads. The first letter was breezy and cheerful, full of Rochester winter observations, and a description of a traveling theatrical company that had performed in the local hall. The second letter was different in tone, quieter, more careful, and it contained the line, "I will admit to you, since we seem to be admitting things, that I have found myself watching the clock on the days when a letter from you might arrive." I'm not certain what to make of that. Stephen stood on the street in February cold and read that line 3 times, and something happened in his chest that he did not entirely have a name for. He sent his own letter, the one written during the blizzard, on the same Tuesday. He rode home feeling lighter than he had in weeks, which was ridiculous, he told himself, since nothing had actually changed. She was still in Rochester. Spring was still months away. Nothing was different. Everything felt different. March came. The snow began its slow retreat, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving patches of brown grass that seemed almost miraculous after the white monotony of winter. The days grew incrementally longer. The mud season arrived with its particular misery, the roads turning to something between soup and glue, every trip into town twice as difficult and twice as filthy as it was in any other season. And in the second week of March, a letter arrived from Evelyn that Stephen would remember for the rest of his life. He opened it right there on the post office step, as he always did, and the first sentence told him everything. "Mr. Mercer, I hope this letter finds you well, because I find I am writing it in some haste. I have had an opportunity to travel west considerably sooner than anticipated. A teacher colleague of mine, a woman named Ruth Hargrove, is traveling with her husband to Kansas City in late March on family business, and they have offered me passage with them on the train as far as Abilene, which is, I believe, some manageable distance from Calla Creek. If you are willing, and if the arrangement remains agreeable to you, I could arrive at Abilene on the 28th of March instead of waiting for April or May. I understand this is very sudden. I understand if it disrupts your arrangements. I only ask that you write back at once and tell me honestly whether you would prefer I wait until spring as originally planned." Stephen read the letter twice. Then he stood up from the step, folded the letter back into its envelope, put the envelope in his breast pocket, walked to his horse, untied her from the post, mounted, and rode home at a pace that startled 2 women crossing the street and caused Walt Greer, who happened to be driving his buckboard toward town, to shout something about slowing down that Stephen did not hear because he was already past him. He sat down at his kitchen table and wrote back that same afternoon, without waiting, without deliberating, without doing any of the careful considering he typically applied to decisions. "Miss Underwood, come as soon as you are ready. Come sooner than that if you like. The 28th of March is not sudden at all. I will be in Abilene when your train arrives. I will be the man standing at the platform looking as though he has not slept well in several months, which will be accurate. I will be glad to see you. Sincerely, Stephen Mercer." He sent the letter with the post rider that same evening, riding out to catch the man before he left the county. Then he went back to the house and sat down and realized that in 3 weeks Evelyn Underwood would be here. Not an abstract spring, not a future concept, 3 weeks. He did not sleep at all that night. The next morning he told Walt over breakfast. Walt set down his coffee cup and looked at Stephen with an expression of great affection and mild amusement. "Well," Walt said, "that explains the riding yesterday. You near ran over Martha Hopkins in the street." "I apologized," Stephen said. "Did you?" "When," Stephen thought about it. "I will apologize next time I see her." Walt shook his head, smiling. "So she is coming early. 3 weeks. 3 weeks." Walt repeated it with the satisfaction of a man who has watched something unfold the way he expected it to. "How do you feel?" Stephen poured himself more coffee and looked at it. "Like I swallowed a stone and a bird at the same time," he said. Walt laughed. It was the good kind of laugh, the kind that filled a room. "That is about right," he said. "That is exactly right." Stephen spent those 3 weeks in a particular kind of productive panic. He cleaned the farmhouse from top to bottom, which it needed badly after a winter of bachelor neglect. He scrubbed the floors and washed the curtains Margaret had put up the year before and repaired the latch on the bedroom door, which had been sticking since November. He rode to town and purchased proper linens from the dry goods store, a new quilt, better candles. He had the blacksmith stove in the kitchen serviced, the flue cleaned, the pipe joints tightened. Margaret came out the second week and walked through the house with a critical eye and gave him a list of additional things to address, which he accepted without argument because she was right about all of them. She rehung the kitchen curtains, which he had put back up crooked, and put a jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill, which he thought was unnecessary but which immediately made the room look less like a place where a man ate alone over a sink. "You are nervous," Margaret observed, watching him sand a rough edge off the kitchen doorframe that no one would ever have noticed. "I am thorough," Stephen said. Margaret smiled and handed him the other piece of sandpaper. "She sounds lovely," she said. "From what you have told me, she is articulate," Stephen said carefully, "and honest. And she has a sense of humor that comes through in letters, which I think is harder to fake than people realize." Margaret looked at him. "You are already fond of her." He sanded the doorframe. "I respect her." "Stephen." He stopped sanding. He looked at his sister. "I have been writing letters to this woman for 5 months," he said quietly. "I have told her things I have not told another person. Yes, I am fond of her. I want this to work very much." "That is not the same as assuming it will." Margaret put her hand on his arm. "It is a good place to start," she said. He nodded. He went back to sanding the doorframe. On the 27th of March, he rode Briar to the livery stable in Calla Creek, paid for boarding, and took the stage to Abilene. It was a 6-hour journey on roads that were still recovering from the mud season, rough and lurching, and he arrived in Abilene in the late afternoon with a sore back and a layer of dust on everything he owned. He found a room at the Drover's Inn, a decent, clean establishment that catered to cattle buyers and traveling families, not the rougher trade that passed through Abilene now that it had become one of the main cattle shipping points on the Kisham Trail. He washed up in his room and looked at himself in the small mirror above the washstand. He was, he acknowledged, a presentable enough man if not a remarkable one. Brown hair that needed cutting, gray beginning at the temples, a square jaw, a straight nose, eyes that his mother had called hazel but that were really just brown in most lights, a face that had been outdoors for most of 31 years, brown and weathered, with lines at the corners of his eyes, hands that showed the work he did. He was not the kind of man who turned heads, but he was solid-looking, he supposed. He looked like what he was. He went down to the hotel restaurant and ate supper without tasting it. He ordered coffee and sat with it until the waitress began looking at him with polite expectation, and then he went back upstairs and lay on top of the bed in his clothes and stared at the ceiling. She was on a train. Right now, at this moment, she was on a train moving across the country toward here. He imagined the train, the particular sound of it, the rhythm of the rails, The way the landscape outside the window would be changing from eastern green to the tawny flatness of the plains. He imagined her looking at it. He wondered what she was thinking. He slept, eventually, in fragments, waking at intervals to check the window and see the dark, unchanged sky, then closing his eyes again and returning to the strange, half-lit country of almost sleep where thoughts moved like horses in a field, purposeful and directionless at once. The 28th of March arrived. He was at the train platform by 8 in the morning, 2 hours before the train was scheduled to arrive. He told himself this was practical. He told himself the roads could be unpredictable and delays happened. He stood on the wooden platform with his hat in his hands and watched the tracks run to the horizon and disappear, and he was aware that he was also just a man who could not stand to be anywhere else. The station master, a compact man named Hobbs who had seen 15 years of arrivals and departures, glanced at Stephen once and did not say anything, but there was a knowing look in his eye that suggested he had seen this particular type of man on this particular platform more than once. Other passengers came and went. A cattle buyer in a fine coat who smelled of money and cigar smoke. 2 young cowboys in from the trail, loud and bright-eyed, probably headed for one of the saloons that had made Abilene both famous and problematic. A family, a tired-looking woman with 4 children arranged around her like planets, waiting for a husband and father who arrived on the 9:30 from the north, and burst off the train with such evident relief and joy at seeing them that Stephen had to look at the tracks for a moment. The 10 o'clock train from the east was announced at 9:55 by Hobbs ringing the platform bell. Stephen put his hat back on. He made himself stand still. He heard it before he saw it, the low, distant rumble becoming a sound, becoming a shape, the big black engine coming out of the flat horizon with its smoke and its noise and its enormous purposeful weight. It slid into the station with a great release of steam, brakes grinding, the sound of it all around and through him, and then it was still. Passengers began to descend. He watched each person come off the train, watched for her, though he had no idea what she looked like beyond what she had told him. Middling height, dark hair, would be wearing a green traveling coat. He saw her. She came off the train behind a heavy-set man in a brown coat, carrying her own bag, not waiting for assistance. She was precisely middling height, dark-haired, wearing a deep green coat that had seen a long journey but still sat well on her shoulders. She stepped onto the platform and set her bag down and looked around with a deliberate, unhurried attention, like a woman taking a reading of her surroundings before deciding anything. Then she looked directly at him. He was aware, in that moment, of several things simultaneously. That she was more genuinely lovely than he had allowed himself to imagine. That her eyes were dark and direct and intelligent. That she was nervous, though she was managing it with impressive composure. And that she was looking at him with the same quality of attention he had been directing at her, the careful, serious look of someone taking a true measure. He walked toward her. He stopped at a proper distance, hat off. "Miss Underwood," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected, clear and steady. She was, he realized, also looking at him with something that might have been relief, as though a piece of information she had been uncertain about had just resolved itself satisfactorily. "You look exactly," she said, "like someone who has not slept well in several months." He laughed, which surprised him, a genuine laugh, sudden and full. "That is accurate," he said. "The letters were honest about that." "They were honest about a good many things," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that told him she had been doing the same reading of his letters that he had been doing of hers, finding the things between the lines. "How was the journey?" he asked, and reached for her bag, which she let him take without protest. "Long," she said, "and extraordinary. The land changes so completely west of Ohio that it feels like arriving on a different continent. I had read about the plains, but reading about them does not prepare you for actually looking at them." "What did you think?" She looked at him steadily. "I thought they were beautiful," she said, "and I thought I understood, standing there looking at it, why a person would choose to build a life out here, There is something about all that space that makes you feel as though anything might still be possible. He held her gaze for a moment. I hope so, he said. That is very much what I am counting on. She looked at him and something shifted in her expression, just fractionally, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family as one. Well then, she said. Show me Calla Creek, Mr. Mercer. They traveled the 6 hours back by stage, and what he had expected to be an awkward journey in close proximity to a woman he did not yet know turned out to be nothing of the kind. She talked with a natural ease that was not chattering. She was not a woman who filled silence just to prevent it, and she asked real questions, not polite ones. She wanted to know about the cattle operation, not the broad strokes but the practical details, how many head, what breeds, what the market looked like out of Abilene this season, what the winter mortality had been. She wanted to know about the land, the soil, what grew and what didn't. She wanted to know about the town, who was in it, what kind of community it was. He answered everything honestly, including the uncomfortable parts, that Calla Creek was small, 40-odd families, a church, a school, a doctor who was competent but not inspired, a general store, a saloon that he personally avoided but that was a fact of the landscape regardless. That the winters were hard and the summers were hotter than anything she would have experienced in Rochester. That the nearest city of any real size was Wichita, a long day's travel south. She listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on his face, and when he finished she said, "That sounds like exactly what it is, and I appreciate you not trying to make it sound better than it is. I did not want you to arrive expecting something different from what you would find," he said. "That is a kind thing," she said. "Most people would have softened the harder parts. I wanted you to come knowing the truth of it," he said, "and still want to come." She looked at him. "I read your letters carefully," she said. "I am a school teacher. I am a trained reader. I could tell what kind of man was writing them." She paused. "I wanted to come," she said simply. The stage hit a rut and they both lurched sideways. She grabbed the window strap and straightened herself and looked entirely unruffled. He thought, with a clarity that startled him, "I am going to be all right. We are going to be all right." They arrived in Calla Creek in the early evening, the light going gold and long across the plains, the town showing itself first as a water tower on the horizon, and then gradually as a proper collection of buildings. The main street was quiet at this hour, a few horses at the rail outside the general store, a woman hanging washing in the breeze from the upper floor of a boarding house. Walt Greer was waiting on Stephen's porch. This had not been arranged, but it did not surprise Stephen at all. Walt stood up from the rocking chair when they pulled in and came down the steps with his slow, arthritic gait, and he looked at Evelyn with an expression of such open warmth and approval that Stephen felt a rush of affection for the old man so strong it nearly knocked him sideways. "Miss Underwood," Walt said, taking off his hat. "Welcome to the flattest place on earth. Walt Greer, your nearest neighbor on the east side. I have been eating this man's cooking for 2 years and I can tell you the biscuits are reliable, but everything else could use a woman's influence." Evelyn looked at Walt with delight. "Mr. Greer," she said, "Stephen has told me about you in his letters. He said you are the best conversationalist in Calla Creek and that you fall asleep in the good chair." Walt looked at Stephen with magnificent betrayal. "You wrote that?" "Accurately," Stephen said. Walt turned back to Evelyn and said with great dignity, "The chair is extremely comfortable." Evelyn laughed, a real, full laugh that rang out in the quiet evening air, and something in Stephen's chest released, like a fist unclenching that he hadn't known was clenched. Walt had brought a basket of things from his pantry, dried beans and a cured ham and a jar of preserved peaches, and had left it on the kitchen table with the simplicity of a man who understood what a person needs at the end of a long journey without being asked. He excused himself shortly after and rode back to his property, and Stephen showed Evelyn the house. It was a proper house by the standards of the prairie, 4 rooms, solid walls, a real floor, not a soddy. He had done his best with it. He watched her face as she went through each room. watched the honest assessment of a practical woman taking stock. She paused in the kitchen, looking at the stove, the shelves, the jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill that Margaret had put there. She touched the windowsill lightly. "Your sister did that," Stephen said. "The flowers. She wanted it to look welcoming. She succeeded." He showed her the bedroom he had prepared for her, the back room, the better one, with the window that faced east and caught the morning light. He had put the new quilt on the bed and the better pillow from his own room. He would take the front room for now. He had told her this in the letter and she had not objected, and he restated it now plainly so there was no ambiguity. They were strangers still, or nearly so. There would be time. "I know this is not what either of us expected in terms of timing," he said, standing in the doorway of the bedroom. "I want you to be comfortable. I want you to have time to settle and decide." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I have been in correspondence with you for 5 months. I have read your words with great care, and I have written mine the same way. I know that meeting in person is different from letters. I know we will need to learn each other properly. But I want you to know that I did not come all this way to be uncertain. I chose this." She paused. "I chose carefully." He held her gaze. "As did I," he said. She nodded once, as though something had been confirmed. She turned back to the east window and looked out at the plains in the last of the evening light. "It is beautiful," she said softly, "in a way I do not entirely have words for yet." He stood in the doorway and looked out the window with her. The sky was going colors that the east did not produce in the same way, deep orange fading through pink to a blue that was almost violet at the far edge of the horizon. The land spread out flat and immense and astonishing. "It grows on you," he said, "or it takes hold of you. I am not sure which. But after a while you cannot imagine living anywhere that the sky is smaller." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I understand that already." The next several weeks were the strangest and most alive that Stephen could remember. Evelyn was in his house, in his kitchen every morning when he came in from the barn, and the fact of her being there was simultaneously entirely ordinary and completely extraordinary, like a word you have read so many times in letters that finally hearing it spoken aloud reveals a whole new dimension of what it means. She was efficient in a way that was not aggressive about it. Within the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen in a manner that turned out to be substantially more logical than his arrangement had been. Found and fixed a draft in the corner of the sitting room that he had been tolerating for 2 winters, and struck up an acquaintance with the wife of the general store owner that yielded, among other things, information about a school in Cala Creek that was operating without a full-time teacher due to the previous one having departed in February for a family situation in Missouri. "I would like to teach," she told him over supper one evening in the second week. "I understand if that is not something you expected." "Why would I not expect it?" He said, "You are a teacher, it is what you do." She looked at him carefully. "Some men would prefer their wives to," she began, and then stopped as though she had surprised herself with the word. He looked at her steadily. "Some men," he said, "are not particularly sensible. I do not need you to be anything other than what you are, Miss Underwood." She looked back at her supper. A moment passed. "Evelyn," she said quietly. He looked up. "You may call me Evelyn," she said, "if you like." "I would like that very much," he said. "Evelyn." She looked up then, and the look on her face was one he would remember for a long time, something between a smile and a question, something careful and warm and entirely real. "Stephen," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it sounded like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. The days opened up after that, became easier, became something that had the texture of a real life beginning rather than an extended introduction. Evelyn applied to teach at the Cala Creek School and was hired within the week by the school board. 3 men who interviewed her in the back room of the general store and were, according to her account of the meeting, initially doubtful about an Eastern woman and subsequently entirely won over once she demonstrated, calmly and without performance, that she knew more about primary education than all 3 of them combined. She rode to school on a brown mare from Stephen's small remuda, a patient, mild horse named Clover who Evelyn took to with no fuss and no pretense about knowing more than she did about riding. She was honest about her limitations. "I have ridden in the East, but not like this," she said the first morning, assessing Clover with her practical eyes. "Tell me what I need to know." He told her. She listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions, mounted with more confidence than most beginners, and rode out of the yard at a walk that became a comfortable trot before she reached the road. He watched her go and stood in the yard for a moment after she had disappeared from sight. Walt came up behind him from wherever Walt appeared from when he was not expected. "You are staring at the empty road," Walt observed. "I am not staring," Stephen said. "You watched her ride away and then continued to look at the place where she had been for some time." Stephen turned and walked toward the barn. "I was checking the weather. It is a clear day. It could change." Walt followed him at his unhurried pace. "You like her," he said. Stephen picked up a brush and started on Briar. "She is a fine person," he said. "You like her," Walt said again, with the serene certainty of a man who is simply correct. Stephen brushed Briar in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I do." Walt sat down on the hay bale he had adopted as his preferred seating in Stephen's barn. "Does she know? We have known each other for 3 weeks." "That is not what I asked." Stephen looked at his horse. "I don't know what she knows," he said honestly. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Stephen, you are a careful man. That is a good quality in many things. It is not always the right quality with a person you care about." Stephen set down the brush. He looked at Walt. "What would you have me do? She is just settled. She is just finding her feet. I am not telling you to do anything tomorrow," Walt said. "I am telling you that careful is good, but silent is not the same thing." He paused. "She came across the country in the middle of winter, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. People do not do that for reasons they cannot name." Stephen thought about that. He thought about her letter, written in haste, telling him of the opportunity to travel early and asking with that careful honesty that was entirely her, whether he would prefer she wait. He had read that letter and understood what it was asking, not just about travel logistics. "I know," he said. "Then act like it," Walt said comfortably, and closed his eyes for what was possibly a nap. April settled over the prairie in that particular way it did in Kansas, when the land that had been dead all winter suddenly made a decision about living, and committed to it absolutely. The grass went green, unbelievably green after the months of gray and brown. The wildflowers that Margaret had put in the jar on the windowsill as dried things were now growing in actual abundance along the creek that ran the eastern boundary of Stephen's land, blue and purple and yellow, nodding in the persistent prairie wind. He found reasons to be around when Evelyn was around. He was not engineering these situations dishonestly. The truth was that the farm's work took him near the house regularly, and she was often there in the evenings, and the evenings were the best part of his day in a way that had not been true in years. They had fallen into a habit of sitting together on the porch after supper when the weather permitted, watching the sky go through its spectacular nightly performance, talking or not talking in a comfortable alternation that he would not have predicted and could not entirely account for. She talked about her students with a love that was entirely unconditional and made him think she was not merely good at teaching, but genuinely called to it in the way some people are called to things. She talked about the land, asking him questions about it, the geology, the weather patterns, the agricultural history, the complicated human history, all of it, with a curiosity that was not performing interest but actually having it. She asked him about the cattle drives, about the Kisham Trail, about what Abilene was like now compared to what it had been 5 years ago when Wild Bill Hickok had been marshal, and the cattle trade had been at its violent, chaotic peak. He told her about it honestly, including the parts that were not romantic, the brutality of the trail life, the exploitation, the way the cattle towns had made their money and their reputations on the backs of men who were often young and poorly paid and sometimes dead before they were old. He told her about the smaller injustices that were harder to name, the way the land deals had worked in those years, the things that had been taken and from whom. She listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she gave everything complete, unperforming, real. And she told him things too in return. About Rochester, about the shifts and changes happening in the East that were not entirely visible from out here on the plains. About the women she knew who were demanding more than they had been given. About her own understanding of what she had given up by coming west and what she had traded it for, and how she did not regret the trade. One evening in the middle of April, they were sitting on the porch in the aftermath of a spectacular sunset that had faded to the deep transparent blue of early night, and the stars were just beginning to appear, and the air was warm enough to be comfortable without a coat, and she said, "I think I was afraid, coming here." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the sky. "Not of you specifically," she said, "of the wrongness of it, of arriving and finding that the person who had written those letters was not what I had understood him to be, that the connection I felt through paper and ink was something I had invented." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And," she turned to look at him, "and you are exactly what I thought you were," she said, "which is surprising, really. Usually the distance between a person on paper and a person in life is considerable." She paused. "It was not with you." He held her gaze. His heart was doing something irregular and unignorable. "For what it's worth," he said, "the same is true from where I am sitting." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "I am glad I came early." "So am I," he said, "more than I can adequately express." The space between them on the porch bench had been diminishing gradually over the past weeks without either of them making a deliberate decision about it. The way things shift when people are comfortable together, and now they were close enough that he was aware of the warmth of her beside him. He was aware of her breathing, the particular way she sat, straight-backed but not rigid, composed but not closed. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I told you in that letter during the blizzard in February that hope was an uncomfortable condition." He paused. "I was understating it somewhat." He turned to look at her properly, not sideways. "I have been thinking about this about you in a way that I did not anticipate. Not that I did not hope for it. He stopped. He started again. "I want to be honest with you because you have been honest with me from the beginning and I owe you the same. I care about you. I care about you more than I have cared about a person in a very long time, possibly more than I have cared about anyone in exactly this way. And I understand if it is too much too soon. I understand that you are still settling in and that, Stephen," she said. He stopped talking. She was looking at him with those direct, dark, intelligent eyes. "I would not have come 3 weeks early for just any arrangement," she said. "I am not an impulsive person. Ask anyone who knows me and they will tell you I deliberate carefully before I act." She paused. "I deliberated very carefully." He looked at her. "I care about you too," she said. It was simple and direct and entirely her. "I have for some time. The letters were not nothing. They were something very real." He reached out slowly and took her hand where it rested on the bench between them. She looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him, and her expression was open in a way he had not seen it before, unguarded, the composure she kept around her like a very fine piece of clothing set aside. "Good," he said, which was entirely inadequate but also entirely true. She laughed softly. He laughed too. And they sat there in the spring night on the porch with their hands linked, and the stars appearing one by one above the immense Kansas dark. And it was one of the best moments of his life, simple and enormous at the same time. They married on the 15th of May, a Saturday, in the Calla Creek Church, which was a white clapboard building that was small and genuine, and did not try to be anything more than what it was. The minister was a young man named Reverend Cole who had arrived in Calla Creek 6 months prior from Missouri, and who took his work seriously without taking himself too seriously, which Evelyn had said was an encouraging quality in a minister. Margaret came with her husband, Thomas Alcott, a quiet, good-natured farmer from the neighboring county who adored Margaret and was slightly afraid of her, which was appropriate. Walt Greer came in his Sunday coat, which he had clearly brushed carefully for the occasion, and sat in the front pew with the expression of a man attending the resolution of something he had been watching for a while. Several families from town came, including the Hendersons from the general store and the Braddock family, whose oldest daughter was one of Evelyn's students, and who had therefore transferred their considerable family loyalty to Evelyn within about 2 weeks of the school term beginning. Evelyn walked into the church on her own, because her father was gone and there was no brother to offer her an arm, and she did it with the same quality she brought to everything, direct and composed and entirely herself, wearing a dress she had made with Margaret's help, a pale blue that suited her coloring, with a small spray of wildflowers pinned at her shoulder that Margaret had gathered that morning from the creek bank. Stephen stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle and thought with complete coherence, "Here is the rest of my life, walking toward me, and I am ready." The ceremony was brief. The vows were the traditional ones, and he meant every word of them, which was not always the case with formal words spoken in formal settings, but these ones he meant with a sincerity that was almost overwhelming. When he took her hand and spoke the words, he was looking at her face and she was looking at his, and the entire church fell away, or might as well have. When Reverend Cole pronounced them married and Stephen kissed her for the first time, a real kiss, not the tentative, careful thing it might have been, there was a sound from Walt Greer in the front pew that was possibly a sniffle and possibly something else, and was never acknowledged. The celebration afterward was at the farmhouse, which had been transformed by the combined efforts of Margaret and approximately 6 other women from the town into something considerably more festive than its everyday state, with tables set up in the yard, food from what seemed like every kitchen in the county, a fiddle player named Crandall who could not play very fast but played very sweetly, and the kind of late afternoon that Kansas produced in May when it was feeling generous, warm, bright, with a breeze that was kind rather than punishing. Evelyn moved through it all with a natural ease that made Stephen watch her with something close to wonder. She knew these people already, had been among them for 6 weeks, had taught their children or shared Sunday services with them, or encountered them in the ordinary commerce of the small town, and she had made herself genuinely known to them in that time, not performing belonging but actually building it, with her characteristic directness and the warmth that lived underneath her composure. He found her late in the afternoon standing near the fence at the edge of the yard, looking out at the land while the celebration went on behind them, and he came to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked. She turned to him with a look that was entirely happy. "More than all right," she said. "I was just looking at it, thinking that this is mine now, in a way that is very new." "It is," he said, "all of it." She leaned into him just slightly, her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her naturally, and they stood there looking at the spring prairie together while the fiddle played behind them and the voices of their neighbors rose and fell in the clear May air. "I was afraid it would not feel real," she said softly. "That I would arrive and it would all be," she paused, "like a very good letter, something I had understood from a distance that would turn out to be different up close. And it is better up close," she said. She looked up at him. "You are better up close." He kissed her then, in the open yard in front of whoever was watching, which was several people, because the kiss earned an audible reaction from the vicinity of Walt Greer that Walt later claimed was a comment about the weather. They settled into life together with the rightness of 2 things that have been made with the same purpose, finding each other at last. He had worried in the abstract about the adjustment. 2 people who had known each other through letters suddenly living in the same 4 rooms, the gap between the understood and the actual. But the adjustment was less difficult than he had feared because they had done their honest work in the correspondence, had told each other the real things rather than the presentable things, and so there were fewer surprises than there might have been. She was not a woman who required constant talk, and he was not a man who required constant quiet. They found a rhythm that was genuinely theirs, not negotiated through discomfort but arrived at naturally, like water finding its own level. She was up before him in the mornings, had coffee on by the time he came in from the first barn check, and they ate breakfast together at the kitchen table in the early light before she rode to school. In the evenings they were together, and the evenings continued to be the best part of his day in a way that had not diminished at all since April. She was also more capable in the practical dimensions of prairie life than he had expected, not because he had underestimated her, but because she surprised him regularly with what she applied herself to. She decided she wanted to learn to shoot, in the practical way of a woman living on the frontier who understood that geography and circumstance sometimes required it, and she asked him to teach her with the same matter-of-fact approach she brought to learning Clover's habits or the names of the wildflowers along the creek. He taught her on the fence posts at the east edge of the property on weekend mornings, and she was methodical and patient, and within a few weeks accurate. She learned the cattle work in a similar way, not that she was going to become a rancher, but she wanted to understand what she was looking at and what it meant. He walked her through it, and she asked the right questions, and by early summer she could tell at a glance whether a cow was off her feed, and knew which sections of fence needed the most attention, and understood the general rhythm of the operation in a way that made them partners in the life of the farm rather than him working it and her adjacent to it. Summer came on hard and fast the way Kansas summers do, the heat building from comfortable to something serious by June. Evelyn managed it without complaint, though he could see the genuine effort it took on the worst days, the 100-degree afternoons when the air itself seemed reluctant to be breathed. She kept a bucket of water in the schoolroom and taught the children to drink regularly, and sat them under the big cottonwood in the schoolyard when the schoolroom became unbearable. She rode home in the early afternoon heat and was in the creek by 4, which he had not expected but entirely respected. He joined her in the creek one afternoon in July when the temperature hit 104, and the cattle were standing motionless in the shade of every tree available, and the water was cool enough to feel like grace after a day in the smithy. They sat in the shallow water at the creek bend where the cottonwoods grew thick, and the light came down through the leaves in shifting patterns, and she was laughing at something he had said about the cattle, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, and the creek water was turning gold in the afternoon light, and he looked at her and felt the full weight of his good fortune in a way that was almost painful with the intensity of it. "What?" she said, seeing his expression. "Nothing," he said. "You are looking at me very seriously for someone sitting in a creek." "I am seriously grateful to be sitting in this creek with you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those dark, steady eyes. Then she said, "I am glad I came early." "You have said that before," he said. "I will keep saying it," she said, "because I mean it more each time." He reached across the water and took her hand and held it, the creek running around their joined hands, cold and clear and insistent. August brought a development that altered the shape of everything in the best possible way. Evelyn was certain by the second week of the month, and she told him on a Sunday morning over breakfast with the same directness she brought to everything, watching his face carefully as she spoke, and his face must have told her immediately what she needed to know because she reached across the table and took his hand before he'd managed to say a word, and what she said was, "You are not going to be able to speak for a minute, and that is all right." She was correct. He was not able to speak for a minute. He held her hand across the table, and when he found his voice it was lower than usual and not entirely steady, and what he said was, "Evelyn." "I know," she said. How do you feel?" "Excellent," she said. Slightly terrified, mostly excellent. He stood up from the table and came around to her, and she stood too, and he held her with a care that was also something else, something vast and humbling and glad. She put her face against his shoulder, and he felt her breathe. And he thought about the letter that had arrived in October, and the winter he had not slept through, and the morning on the Abilene platform when the train had come out of the flat horizon, and she had stepped off it and looked directly at him. He thought about all the distance between then and now, all the miles of letter writing and worry and hope, and how it had led here to this kitchen, this woman, this morning, this news. Walt came for Sunday dinner as he always did, and when Stephen told him, Walt sat very still for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was roughly even, "Well, that is fine news. That is very fine news." And he clapped Stephen on the shoulder once, hard, and then was occupied for a moment with his coffee cup, and nothing more needed to be said. Margaret drove out the following Saturday and cried, which was the most emotional anyone had ever seen Margaret, and then recovered herself and became immediately practical about preparations, which was the most Margaret thing possible. She and Evelyn sat together at the kitchen table making lists, with the focused efficiency of two women who understand that time is finite and organization is love in practical form. Evelyn continued to teach through September and into October, until it became too apparent to be comfortable in a professional sense, and even then she went in for 2 more weeks to settle the school's transition, having recruited and recommended to the school board a young woman named Agatha who had recently arrived in Calla Creek with her husband and had a teaching background from Indiana. She handed the school off with enormous care, writing notes on every student, every family situation worth knowing about, every particular learning style and difficulty and gift. The night after her last day, she sat on the porch with Stephen and was quiet for a long time, looking at the dark prairie. "Do you miss it already?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly, "and I will teach again, when things are settled and Agatha has found her footing," and when she paused and put her hand over her middle with the unconscious gesture she had developed recently. "When things are settled, the school will be glad to have you back," he said. "I know," she said, not with vanity but with the same straightforwardness she applied to facts. "I am good at it." "You are," he said. "The children," he started and then paused. "Tommy Braddock told me last week that Miss Evelyn was the best teacher in all of Kansas. He seemed to regard this as settled fact." She laughed. "Tommy Braddock also told me last week that his dog could count to 5, so perhaps his assessment should be taken with some qualification." "He could be right on both accounts," Stephen said. She leaned into his arm and he put his hand over hers where it rested on her middle, and the night spread out around them warm and dark and full of stars. Their son arrived on the 14th of February, 1878, in the bedroom with the east window that caught the morning light. He was born in the early hours of the morning before dawn, and by the time the sun came up and the light came through the east window in that particular way it did, painting the floor gold, the room contained 3 people instead of 2. Stephen held his son with the careful terror of a man who has never held something so important and so fragile and so completely alive, and Evelyn lay in the bed watching him with a tiredness that was also the deepest peace he had ever seen on a human face. "He looks like you," she said, "around the eyes." Stephen looked at the small face, the eyes that were not focused yet but were open, taking in the light. "He looks like himself," he said. "What should we call him?" she said. They had discussed names, had lists, had debated with the pleasant circularity of 2 people who both have opinions and enjoy having them but had not settled. Stephen looked at his son. He thought about Walt Greer, who had known this land for 40 years and had sat in that barn on his hay bale and told Stephen not to let careful become silent. He thought about what it meant to have someone in your life who had seen you clearly from the beginning. "Walter," he said. "If you agree." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yes, that is right." They named him Walter James Mercer, James being her father's name, and when they told Walt Greer 2 days later, the old man went to the window of the farmhouse and looked out at the land for a moment in silence, and then turned back with the kind of expression that does not need to be explained. "That is too much honor for an old man who falls asleep in chairs," Walt said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "You have been more to this family than you know," Evelyn told him from the bed, where she was sitting up against the pillows looking both newly delivered and entirely composed in that remarkable way she had. "And we want Walter to know you. We want him to know you well." Walt sat down in the chair beside the bed and looked at the baby in the basket, and was quiet for a long time with the particular quality of quiet that is full rather than empty. The months that followed were the hardest and the best of Stephen's life, in the way that all new parenthood is both of those things at once, and he and Evelyn navigated them with the same quality that had characterized their whole beginning honestly, with humor when they could find it, with the willingness to ask for help and offer it without keeping score. Walt was there several times a week, often enough that young Walter came to know his face before he knew many others, and would settle when held by the old man with a trust that was immediate and absolute. Margaret came regularly, and was as practically useful as she was emotionally supportive, which was to say enormously so. The community of Calla Creek, which had been generous from the beginning, became more so, as communities do around a new life, arriving with food and offers of help in the matter-of-fact way of people who understand that the collective management of existence is not charity but simply sense. By summer, Evelyn was back at the school, having worked it out with Agatha that they would share the teaching responsibilities through a practical arrangement that suited them both and gave the school more capacity than it had had before. Stephen's mother came down from Topeka in August for 3 weeks and was, to his relief and delight, immediately won over by Evelyn in a way that made the visit something other than the ordeal he had privately feared it might be. She held Walter and declared him the best-looking baby she had seen in years, and told Stephen privately, on the back porch, that he had done well for himself. "You always needed someone who would match you honestly," his mother said, which was more psychological insight than she had offered him in the previous decade, but he received it gratefully and agreed. He went inside and found Evelyn at the kitchen table with Walter on her knee, and a letter she was writing to her friend Ruth Hargrove, who had facilitated her early journey west, and who had become a regular correspondent, and who was, according to the most recent letter from her, thinking of applying for a teaching position in Kansas herself. Evelyn was writing back with encouragement and practical information, and the particular warmth she offered things she believed in, and she looked up when Stephen came in with a smile that was so natural and so entirely glad to see him that it still did something to his chest, the way it had from the beginning. "Your mother is looking at the vegetable garden," she said. "She does that," Stephen said. "She has opinions about vegetable gardens." "She has opinions about everything," Evelyn said. "I like her very much." He sat down across from her at the table and watched Walter reach for the pen in her hand, with the single-minded determination that was already entirely his own personality. "No," Evelyn told the baby, with a firmness that was also affectionate, and redirected his hand. He reconsidered and grabbed her finger instead, which he examined with great seriousness. Stephen watched this and thought, "I have not slept poorly in a very long time." It was true. The winter he had not slept through, lying awake listening to the wind and thinking about a woman he had not yet met, thinking about spring and what it might bring, and whether the thing he was hoping for was something real or something he had built out of ink and longing. That winter felt like another life. Not a bad memory, not a regret, but a distance crossed that made the current ground firmer for the crossing of it. He thought about the letter in October. He thought about the correspondence through those months, the way she had become real to him incrementally, in the best way, layer by layer, through the honesty of what she put on paper and what he put on paper back. He thought about the blizzard letter, the one he had written when the roads were closed, and he had told her that hope was an uncomfortable condition, and how she had already been writing to him by then with the unmistakable subtext of someone who was also hoping and also somewhat afraid of it. He thought about the platform at Abilene, the train coming out of the horizon, her stepping off it, looking directly at him. He thought about the spring nights on the porch and the creek in the summer heat, and the wedding in the white church, and the morning in the kitchen when she had told him about Walter, and all the mornings before and after that made up the ordinary, extraordinary fabric of this life. 2 years. 2 years since the letter arrived in October and turned him into a man who couldn't sleep. Now he slept well and deeply, and woke to the sound of Walter making his morning announcements from the basket in the corner of the room, and to Evelyn already awake beside him, sometimes reading in the early light, sometimes watching the dawn through the east window with that quality of attention she gave everything. Walt Greer died in October of 1879. He died peacefully in his own house, in his own bed, which was a good death by any measure, and he was 81 years old, which was a long and full life. And he had told Stephen the previous summer that he was content in a way he had not been in many years, and that having a family next door, because that was how he described them, as his family, with the plainness of someone stating a fact, had made the last years of his life something better than he had expected them to be. Stephen and Evelyn buried Walt on the hill behind his property, beside his wife Elinor, who had died in 1861, and beside the small graves of 2 children who had not made it past infancy, which was the particular, frequent grief of those years that people carried quietly. They stood at the grave in the October cold with Walter, nearly 2 years old now, on Evelyn's hip, and said goodbye to the best neighbor Stephen had ever known, and the man who had sat on a hay bale in his barn and told him not to let careful become silent, which was advice that had changed everything. They brought Walt's dog, an old hound named Biscuit who had belonged to the neighbor for a decade, back to their farm, where Biscuit lived out his remaining years in the kitchen and occasionally on the good chair which seemed appropriate. The farm grew. Stephen expanded the cattle operation through careful reinvestment over the following years, adding acreage when the adjacent property came available in 1880, and taking on a hand named Everett, a young man from Missouri, 19 years old, who was reliable and honest and learned quickly. The blacksmith work remained a steady supplemental income, and Stephen was good enough at it that people came from other towns for particular work, which was a satisfaction not merely financial but genuine, the satisfaction of skill that had been built over time and was now worth something. Evelyn taught. She taught through 3 subsequent years, taking time with each new child and returning each time with the same assurance and capability, and the particular love for the work that made her students remember her long after they had moved on to other teachers, other places. She was a constant presence in the school not merely as a teacher, but as a genuine influence on the educational culture of Calla Creek, pushing the school board with her characteristic combination of logic and persistence toward better books, better desks, a proper school building to replace the cramped original structure. The new school building opened in 1881 and was the best in the county, and the school board gave Evelyn the credit in the most public way they had, which was naming one of the classrooms for her, which she accepted with graciousness and private amusement. Their daughter arrived in March of 1880, 2 years after Walter, born in the same east window bedroom at the end of a spring night that went to day while the labor was still happening, so she arrived with the light. They named her Elinor, for Walt's wife, and she was from the beginning an entirely different creature from her brother Louder, more immediately social, interested in everything and everyone with an intensity that sometimes required careful management. Walter was his mother's child in temperament, methodical and observant. Elinor was something else, something that was all her own, or possibly something very old in the family that had been waiting to come back around. Walter loved his sister with a patient devotion that began the first day and never wavered. He explained things to her, as soon as she was old enough to follow him around, with the serious thoroughness of a child who has absorbed his mother's teaching instincts by proximity. He told her the names of the wildflowers and the proper way to approach clover, so as not to startle her, and the way to read the weather by the color of the afternoon sky. The information he had received from his parents transferred with the earnestness of a small ambassador. Stephen watched his children and felt, repeatedly, the same quality of feeling that had hit him the morning Evelyn told him about Walter Vast, humbling, glad. He had not expected this, or rather, he had not known how to expect it. He had hoped for a good life and a partnership and children, the practical, reasonable hopes of a practical, reasonable man. He had not fully understood that what was coming was the thing itself, not the outline of it, not the reasonable facsimile, but the real live thing in all its weight and color and sound. He told Evelyn this, one evening in the summer of 1881. They were on the porch again. They spent their evenings on the porch all summer, watching the stars arrive, and Walter was inside already sleeping, and Abilene was in Evelyn's lap making the sounds of a child who is nearly asleep but committed to maintaining appearances. "I did not know," he said, "that it would be this." She looked at him. Abilene made a decisive sound and settled deeper. "I thought I knew what I was hoping for," he said, "when the letter came in October. I thought I knew the shape of what might be possible, but I did not know the actual thing. I could not have." She was quiet for a moment, her hand on Aline's back, the child's breathing going slow and deep. Then she said, "I know what you mean. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was making a good, considered decision, which I was, but I did not know." She paused. "I did not know what was on the other side of it." "What did you think was on the other side of it?" he asked. She looked out at the dark prairie. "Something decent," she said. "Something real. A life that was mine, that I had chosen, that made sense." She turned to look at him. "Not this." "Not what?" She looked at him with the direct, unguarded look that she had shown him first on the night they had sat together, and admitted to each other that they cared for each other. The composure set aside, the real thing visible. "Not someone I love like this," she said simply. "I did not think that was in the arrangement." He reached across Abilene and took Evelyn's free hand. "It was not in the arrangement," he said. "It happened anyway." She looked down at their joined hands and Aline's sleeping weight and then up at him, and her expression was the one he loved most, the one that was warm and real and entirely her. "I am glad it happened anyway," she said. "As am I," he said. "More than I have ever been glad about anything." Abilene snored once, distinctly, in the manner of a child who has very strong feelings about everything, including sleep. They both looked down at her, and then at each other, and laughed quietly in the summer dark. The years moved with the particular quality of years that contain real life, quickly in retrospect, fully occupied in the living of them. There were hard seasons and good ones. There was a drought in 1882 that took a portion of the herd and required the kind of careful financial management that consumed 2 winters of planning and work. There were the ordinary griefs of frontier life, neighbors lost to illness or moving on, the specific sadness of watching the land change as more people arrived, and the wildness of it diminished incrementally. There were the births of 3 more children. James, called Jamie in 1883, named for Evelyn's father, a quiet, broad-shouldered boy who was from the beginning interested primarily in the physical work of the farm, and twin girls, Ruth and Clara, in 1885, named for Evelyn's friend Ruth Hargrove, and for the little girl in the Cincinnati classroom who had cried every morning and stayed reading till dark, both names carrying in them a piece of Evelyn's history. Ruth Hargrove herself had eventually come to Kansas, arriving in 1881 and teaching in a town 40 miles north of Cala Creek, and the friendship between Ruth and Evelyn remained one of the sustaining constants of their lives, carried through letters and occasional visits, the correspondence now having a different quality than it had once had, but still full of the honest, lively exchange of 2 women who genuinely interested each other. Everett, the hand Stephen had hired in 1880, married a woman named Dorothy in 1884 and stayed on, building a small house on the east edge of the property near the creek, and became not merely an employee but genuinely part of the household in the extended way that frontier living organized itself. people bound by proximity and work and need into arrangements that were something more than professional but something different from family. The specific community that the land itself seemed to require. Walter grew into a serious, able young man with his mother's mind, and something of his father's stubbornness, and a quality that was entirely his own, a kind of still, watchful intelligence that surprised people who expected from a farm boy something rougher. He read everything the family could get him, which was considerable given that Evelyn's teaching had made the household one of the better stocked in reading material in the county. He helped his father with the cattle and the smithing and paid attention to all of it with a focus that made Stephen think, watching him, that whatever Walter decided to do with the knowledge was going to be done well. Abilene, as predicted by her earliest character, was a force. She taught herself to ride with a confidence that slightly terrified Stephen before he accepted that she was, in fact, extremely competent. She argued points with her father and her mother with equal vigor and insufficient deference, which both of them managed with the patient consistency of parents who understand that a child's strength of character is an asset even when it is directed at you. She made friends with the same ease she made enemies. Total commitment, no ambivalence, and was, by the time she was 12, already the person the other children in Cala Creek referred their problems to. Jamie was quieter than his siblings, more like the land itself. Stephen sometimes thought steady and wide, and not requiring explanation. He loved the cattle with a real feeling, not just the familiarity of someone who has grown up around them, but a genuine interest in their well-being and management. By the time he was 10, he was more useful in the operation than men twice his age, not because he was precocious, but because he was attentive and took the work seriously, and was never doing something halfway when the whole way was available. The twins were Ruth and Clara, and were so different from each other that the fact of their simultaneous arrival seemed like a deliberate cosmic joke. Ruth was her mother's name repeated, methodical, precise, with a love of books that was almost physical. Clara was her father's worry made flesh. She was funny and bold and utterly fearless, which required, on a working cattle farm, constant vigilance from everyone around her. Stephen and Evelyn raised all 5 of them in the farmhouse that had expanded twice now, a new wing added in 1882, and another room above the existing structure in 1886, the house growing as the family inside it grew. The original 4 rooms that he had scrubbed and prepared for her arrival, now the heart of something considerably larger and fuller than he had allowed himself to imagine on those sleepless winter nights before she came. He thought about those nights sometimes, in the particular way a person thinks about a past difficulty from the comfort of its resolution, with something like gratitude for the distance crossed. He had stood at a frost-crusted window and watched the wind bend the dead grass, and wondered about a woman whose face he did not know and whose voice he had not heard, and the wondering had been so charged with hope and uncertainty that it had kept him from sleep for months. Now he knew her face in every light and every mood, the particular way she looked in the early morning reading by the east window, the way she looked across the kitchen table at their children, the way she looked at him in the moments that were only for them, quiet and clear and warm with the certainty of a love that had been growing for years, and had not diminished but deepened, which is the thing about real love that no arrangement can guarantee, but that sometimes happens anyway, in spite of, and because of everything. In the fall of 1887, a decade after Evelyn had stepped off the train at Abilene and looked at him across a dusty platform, Stephen rode out to the east fence line in the late October afternoon and stood in the spot where, 10 years before, he had stood on a sleepless November night and looked at the moon above the flat land and thought about a letter in his pocket and a woman in Rochester, and a spring that felt impossibly far away. He stood in the same spot now and looked at the same land, which had the same quality of enormous quiet that the autumn always brought back, and thought about all of it, the whole chain of it from October to here, from the letter to the 5 children who were at this moment in the farmhouse, a quarter-mile away doing whatever they were doing, probably something that required intervention. Given that Evelyn and Clara in the same house without parental supervision was a specific situation, and thought about Evelyn, who was at the school in town this afternoon, teaching, doing the thing she was meant for. He thought, I did not know, and then I know now. He rode back to the farmhouse and found, as predicted, a situation involving Evelyn and Clara that required his attention, and then his arbitration, and then, once resolved, his laughter, which he provided freely. He put supper on the stove, which he had learned to do adequately if not brilliantly in the first years of the marriage, and had improved at gradually because the alternative was cold biscuits, and he had done enough of those. Walter helped without being asked, setting the table with the quiet usefulness that was his nature. Jamie brought in wood. Ruth had her nose in a book at the kitchen table, and Clara was drawing something on a piece of brown paper with the intensity of someone working on something important. Evelyn had apparently decided the crisis of the afternoon was over and was giving a detailed account of it to Biscuit the Hound, who was in the kitchen in defiance of the rule about dogs in the kitchen that no one actually enforced. Evelyn came home as the sun was going down, Clover's hoofbeats coming across the yard, and the sound of them was, to Stephen, the sound of everything settled and right, and where it was supposed to be. He heard the children react to the sound, Walter going to the door, Clara dropping her drawing, Evelyn cutting off her account to the dog, and he watched through the kitchen window as she dismounted, and was immediately surrounded by 4 of the 5, the 5th, Ruth, arriving a measured moment later because she did not like to appear eager about things, which was a trait her mother recognized and privately found amusing. Evelyn moved through the children the way she moved through everything, with the attention and warmth that gave each of them the full experience of being seen. And then she looked up and saw Stephen watching from the window, and her expression shifted to the one that was for him, the particular one, and she put her hand up in a small gesture that meant nothing translatable and everything in the language of them. He went to the door and held it open, and she came inside, bringing with her the smell of October air and chalk dust and the general essence of a day well spent, and she stopped in the doorway where he was and looked at him for a moment. "Good day?" he asked. "Excellent," she said. Tommy Braddock's youngest started today. He cried at the door for 10 minutes and was the last one still reading when school let out. His mother would be proud, Stephen said. His mother was there to see it, Evelyn said, with the satisfaction of someone who has watched a good thing come around again. He stepped back to let her in, and she came past him into the kitchen, which was full of children and noise and the smell of supper on the stove, and she stood in the middle of it and looked at all of it for a moment and then looked at Stephen in the doorway. "Everything all right," she said. "More than all right," he said. "Come eat supper." They ate supper at the big table, all 7 of them, in the comfortable, slightly chaotic way of a large family that has learned to coexist in small spaces without losing each other. The conversations overlapping and occasionally incompatible, the food passing in all directions, Biscuit making his low and persistent case from beneath the table. Evelyn and Clara had reconciled sufficiently to be allied in some new project that they were describing to Evelyn with an enthusiasm that made Stephen certain it would require parental modification. Walter explained something to Jamie with careful patience. Ruth read 3 pages of her book before Evelyn gently moved it off the table. Stephen sat at his end of the table and watched it all, the noise and warmth and fullness of it, and thought about the letter that had come in October 10 years ago, and the winter he had not slept through, and felt the particular deep gladness of a man who has arrived exactly where he was supposed to be and knows it. Later, after the children were in bed, after the dishes were done and the fire was banked for the night, he and Evelyn sat on the porch in the October cold, wrapped in the quilt she had brought out from the sitting room, and looked at the stars above the dark prairie. "Do you know what I thought about today?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "The letter," she said. "The letter I wrote in March. When Ruth and her husband offered to take me west with them, I almost didn't write it." He looked at her. "I almost waited," she said. "I almost thought it is only 6 weeks, maybe 8, until I can go properly, until spring, until the arranged time. I almost thought it is too soon, it will seem too eager." "What changed your mind?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I read your last letter again," she said. "The one about the blizzard. About the particular quiet of the winter and hoping being an uncomfortable condition." She paused. "I thought, this is not a man who needs to be managed or handled carefully. This is a man who will be honest with me if I am honest with him. And I was tired," she said. "I was very tired of the distance, of knowing you only through paper when there was a way to know you in actual life." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad you wrote it." "I know," she said. "I am also glad," he said, "that I wrote back immediately without deliberating." She smiled, the one that was warm all the way through. "You wrote within the hour," she said. "I could tell by the handwriting." "The handwriting. You write more fluidly when you are writing from feeling rather than from care," she said. "I had been reading your letters for months. I knew the difference by then." He stared at her. "You could tell from the handwriting." "I am a school teacher," she said. "I look at handwriting for a living." He laughed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you know what I thought," he said, "on the platform at Abilene? When the train came in and I was watching the passengers and I saw you," she waited. "I thought, I am already in trouble," he said. "I had thought that earlier, reading one of your letters. And then I saw you step off that train and I thought it again, but worse. Or better." He paused. "I could not decide which." She lifted her head and looked at him. The starlight was enough to see her face by. "What did you decide?" "Better," he said. "Considerably better every day since." She looked at him for a long moment with the full force of that direct, intelligent, entirely hers gaze. Then she put her hand on his chest, over his heartbeat, the way she sometimes did, a gesture she had made from somewhere early in them and never stopped making. "We should go in," she said. "It is cold." "We should," he agreed, neither of them moving. The stars above the Kansas plain were dense and brilliant in the October dark. The same stars that had been above this land for 1,000 years before either of them was on it, before the farmhouse, or the road, or the wire fence along the eastern boundary, the same stars that would be above it long after. Below them the land was flat and wide and enormous in its silence, and the farmhouse was warm with the residual heat of the family inside it, children asleep in their beds, the dog on the floor, the fire low, all the evidence of a life built carefully and lived fully and loved without reservation. Stephen Mercer had not slept well all winter once. He had stood at a window in the frost and wondered and hoped and been afraid to hope and hoped anyway. And she had come. Not in spring, when the arrangement said she would come, but sooner, because she too was done waiting for the arranged time when the real thing was available. She had not been supposed to arrive until spring. She had arrived in the last week of March, in the mud and the cold and the beginning of things, and everything that came after, the porch evenings and the creek and the wedding in the white church and Walter born in the February dawn, and a leaner loud from her first breath and the 5 of them. The whole particular, irreplaceable them, all of it had come from that. He pulled her closer in the quilt and she let him, settling against his side with the ease of years of practicing this, and they sat together in the October night and looked at the stars above the place that was theirs, the life that was theirs, that had been built from hope and honesty, and a letter written in haste by a woman in Rochester who had decided, at the last possible moment, to stop being careful and simply go. He was glad with everything he had that she had.